Blessed New Year, everyone. Hope this year will be a good one for you. We're going to keep on working our way through the Old Testament. I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Today we're looking at 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 1 to 12. Solomon has finished building the temple, and he now turns to take care of his own residence. There's a lesson for us right there. Putting the things of God ahead of our own things and our own desires and our own goals as we realize that everything comes from God. But let's see what else we can gain from the passage. Verse 1 tells us it took him 13 years to build his house. That's 6 years more than it took to build the temple. Was it more elaborate, or did he have fewer workers to work with? You'll remember that the temple had workers from each of Israel's tribes or areas. Now, verses 2 to 8, the first part of 8, verses 2 to the first part of 8, give us the details of the construction. It's not unlike what we were given for the temple in the previous chapter. In the second part of verse 8, we're told he also built a house for Pharaoh's daughter that he had married. I guess in those days, if you had many wives, you needed many houses. At least he needed one more. Anyway, this is where that particular wife kept her court. We also don't know whether the time it took to build this house is part of the number of years it took to build his own house. We don't know if it's part of the 13 years or not. The rest of the passage seems to describe the elaborate cost of the materials, both inside and outside the house and in the courtyards, but again, not unlike what went into the building of the temple. But let's dig a little deeper and see what else we can learn. The NAT translation tells us in verse 1 that Solomon named his palace, quote, the Palace of the Lebanon Forest, as the wood for the pillars had come from Lebanon, as we learned last time. And their number, that is the number of pillars, were such that they must have given the palace the appearance of a forest. Robert Jameson points out that we have a similar peculiarity of name, at least, in the building called the East India House, though it was situated nowhere in India, but rather in London, England itself. So here we have the House of the Lebanon Forest. The palace that Solomon built included a throne room called, quote, the hall, or as some referred to it as the porch of judgment, where he made judicial decisions. On the other hand, Matthew Henry seems to think that there were two palaces involved in this passage, the main one in Jerusalem and this other one called the Palace not of Lebanon, but the palace at Lebanon. He writes, quote, he built the house of the forest at Lebanon, verse 2, supposed to be a country seat near Jerusalem, so called from the pleasantness of its situation and the trees that encompassed it. I rather incline to think, he goes on, that it was a house built in the forest of Lebanon itself. Solomon, having so many chariots and horses and those dispersed into chariot cities, which probably were his stages, might frequently retire with ease to such a place. It does not appear that his throne, mentioned in verse 7, was at the house of the forest of Lebanon. End of quote. Well, again, you decide. It all depends on how one interprets the Hebrew phraseology for, quote, the house of the forest of Lebanon. Is it location-driven, or is it wood source-driven? I personally am not convinced that there were two palaces. As I read the various commentators on this passage, I note also that all seem to commend Solomon for building God's house first and then his own. But after that, the commentators seem to disagree as to the reason Solomon took 13 years to build his own house and only 7 to build the temple. A number see this as a problem with his priorities, wanting his own place to be so much more elaborate. And he was also very, very picky about how everything was being built. Others see it as a good thing, as Matthew Henry will show us in a moment. I personally believe we don't have enough. We don't know the actual reason. We don't have enough evidence to think one way or other. We only have the facts of how long it took. As I mentioned above, we do not know if he had the same workforce working on his palace as he did for the temple. I rather doubt it. So I'm not ready to accuse him of wrong priorities at this time because it took longer to build his house than to build the temple. I also like the arguments put forward by Henry. He writes, quote, "He was 13 years building this house, whereas he built the temple in little more than 7 years. Not that he was more exact, but less eager and intent in building his own house than in building God's. He was in no haste for his own palace, but impatient till the temple was finished and fit for use. Thus, we ought to prefer God's honor for our own ease and God's honor before our own ease and satisfaction." End of quote. I personally like that. Maybe his wives weren't bugging him enough to get the palace built. And you know what they say about the cobbler's children, they're the ones without shoes. So if I remember anything, my dad used to help everybody else with their projects because he was a cabinet maker and a carpenter, and our stuff was only left when he had absolutely nothing to do and he was bored from not doing anything. Robert Jameson seems to support what Matthew Henry says when he says, quote, "The time occupied in building his palace was nearly double that spent in the erection of the temple," 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 38, because neither had there been the same previous preparation. So here's another reason. There had not been these preparations for it, and much more planning had to go into this house. Nor was there the same urgency as in providing a place of worship on which the national well-being so much depended. End of quote. The national well-being was more important to Solomon than his own comfort. Anyway, I buy that as well. But as we always try to do in our studies, we point out some controversial positions, as we just did, and want you to decide for yourself. So what can we take away? Well, for starters, regardless of what Solomon did and why, we're always supposed to put the things of God, and that doesn't necessarily mean the brick and mortar building of our local church, but rather the values and the truths and the tenets of God first and foremost in our lives. Those should be our priorities. Second, let's remember that we're all mortal, and whatever we built, we can't take with us when we die. Solomon found that out, as we will. Sometimes it does not last even that long. Anything can destroy it. A hurricane, a war, evil of all sorts. And as many very rich people have already found out, we can't always assume that our children will preserve it forever. Just look at some of the great industrial magnates of history and how their children and grandchildren squandered the estates they were left. At the same time, we're not to be afraid to put quality materials and quality work in all that we do, not only for God, but for others. Those are the lessons for me, at least. I'm sure you have more. Next time, we'll take a brief look at some of the more significant furnishings of the temple and their importance or significance. Join us for that. In the meantime, if you like what you saw and heard, please indicate so on the YouTube page that you're watching. Give us a like. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Digging for Scriptural Gems. But above all, keep on studying God's Word, and I look forward to hearing from you with your thoughts and comments and to seeing you next time.